My work grows out of, inspired by three major movements for social justice in U.S. history. The first was the movement of working people in the 1930s for a 40-hour work week, for the weekend, unions, healthcare. Many of the things that we take for granted today were struggled for at great cost during the 30s and 40s. The second movement that's inspired my work is the civil rights movement, the struggle of African Americans for the end of segregation and full participation and equality in this society. And the third movement was the women's liberation movement, the struggle of women for end of male violence and full rights, participation, and opportunities in our lives. My work particularly grows out of the women's movement and the parts of the women's movement that dealt with issues of male violence, the battered women's movement, rape prevention movement, child sexual assault movement, things like that. And what I found over the years of doing this work is that there's two questions that I use to guide me in thinking about what I am doing and how. First question is one that we often ask ourselves. The question is, what do I stand for? Right? It's a question we check in with ourselves about, you know, am I a person of integrity, of trust, of respect? What are the values that I live by? What kind of moral person am I? But there's another question I have found that is equally as important but often overlooked. And the second question is, who do I stand with? And that's a question that really is much harder to ask and much harder to answer. For instance, when I first started doing anti-racism work in the late 1960s, African Americans would come to me and some of my friends who were white, and they'd be angry and outraged at the racism that was going on around them, that they were experiencing and seeing. And my first impulse was to throw up my hands and say, well, I'm not racist. I'm colorblind. I treat everybody with respect. And they said, well, that's fine, but it's not about you. There's racism in the school system and in the criminal justice system and the housing market and the job market. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a much harder question, because at the root of that question is, what are you doing? Do you stand up with us in the struggle? 10 years later, when I started doing work around sexism and issues of gender and male violence, again, women were angry and upset at the levels of male violence. And they came to some of us who were men and expressed that anger. And again, my first response is, well, I don't hit my partner. I treat women respectfully. I share the chores and the cooking. And they said, that's fine. But there's 2 or 3 or 4 million men a year in this country who batter their partners. Do you stand with us in the struggle to end male violence? And again, that was a hard question to ask. So the question I'm really here to grapple with you today is, who do you stand with? And how do we stand together with the young people in this community who most need our support? I want to say just a couple words about the context that we're in, because we're in a particular historical time and place and reality. We're at war. We're at war in Afghanistan. We're at war in Iraq. We've got military bases around the world. Our society has been militarized, and that has a tremendous impact on our daily lives. One of the impacts, obviously, is tremendous cutbacks in our social services, with billions, hundreds of billions of dollars going overseas to fight those wars and into the pockets of corporations like Bechtel and Halliburton that siphons money right out of our communities, out of the healthcare and educational systems and housing and everything else. It also means that war is glamorized in our culture, and it also means that many of our young people are faced with the only way of getting to college is to enlist, or to get a job is to enlist. And so the militarization of our society has multiple levels at which it not only affects our lives, but it affects the lives of young people in the community. And that's part of the context that we have this discussion in. I've spent nearly 30 years in the Bay Area being in and out of a vast number of schools around the various counties, doing workshops and trainings addressing issues of domestic violence, dating violence, racism, bullying, variety of kinds of issues. And I've raised 3 children in, seems like a multitude of schools, also in and out of many schools, both public and independent. And one of the things that is really clear is that the educational system has deteriorated dramatically in that 30-year period, starting with coming to the presidency of Ronald Reagan in 1980, clear and steady attacks on public education, moves to privatize public education, to defund them, to put restrictions on them. No Child Left Behind is an example of the kinds of tremendous government manipulation of our educational system. I could list many, many of the things that have happened over that 30 years, but I think the general picture that we have to acknowledge is, despite the promises that we felt in the 60s and 70s about the possibilities of changing our communities, that they've been under consistent attack, and that and young people know that very intimately. And we can see it in the graduation rates. We can see it in the, I don't use the word dropout, I use the word push out, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. There's also a lot of demographic changes going on in our communities. And I just want to mention this, this probably will be talked about a little later, but Marin County now is about 80% white, 20% people of color. Within the next 30 years, that will change to be about 60% white, 40% people of color, which means that the student population will be probably closer to 50% students of color. Now, as that change has been and will continue to occur, the teaching force, the teaching staff in this country has become more and more white. You would think that that would not be true, but it is now up to almost 90% white. That's primarily young white women from rural and suburban areas teaching an increasingly multiracial, diverse, economic diverse student body. That doesn't work. It means on several levels, and I'm sure you all know why it doesn't work. It means that students are not being taught by teachers who share their culture and backgrounds and experience. It means that they're being taught by teachers who in fact don't have any understanding of their cultures and experience, and who are ill-prepared, coming from backgrounds in which they've been themselves segregated and misinformed. And so that's one of the realities that we have to deal with, is the demographics have tremendous implications for what we do, what kind of strategies we come up with. So I want to do a couple of things with you to help us kind of look at where we want to go and what we can do. But the main question is, are we thinking about and visualizing the kind of educational system we want to see, and are we coming together strategically to think about what it's going to take to do what we want to do? And one of the things I find is that, particularly in education, because the problems are so daunting and the everyday struggles most of us face, whether as parents or students or teachers or administrators, are so daunting, that we don't often get a chance to step back and actually imagine the kind of education we would like to see for our children. So I want to do a very short visualization with you to help you reclaim some vision of what it could be like in the schools here in Marin for all of our children.